Yeah, a couple things I'll say to that. You asked a question about, where does it go from here? Think about it this way. You just mentioned taking the paper stock ticket as the way it was back in the day. That was minutes per trade. Now it's down to microseconds. What happens when it's femtoseconds? And that gets you out of infrastructure and into switching and other appliance-driven matters. In terms of how you protect, though, there is a truth, and this was discovered painfully after September the 11th, and there's a document that anyone who wants to understand why fiber and wireless have to coexist, it's a mouthful, but it's the Lower Manhattan Telecommunication Users Workers Group. It was headed up by a number of the property owners, the telecommunication folks, and the technology folks, and I had the privilege of being part of the discussion. The conclusion is you can't have a truly diverse, truly secure, truly protected capability unless you have multiple paths, multiple mediums, and multiple ways in and out of whatever it is you're trying to connect to. If you don't do those three things, then by definition, I think you should say we want reward, but we'll take the risk, right? So that's the trade-off that gets made, and sometimes it gets made as a calculated risk. Many times it gets made as a foolish risk, but it really does come down to, I think, education for the users and sometimes the bystanders in terms of what they're getting themselves into. That's probably the bad news. The good news is I think the bystanders are getting a little bit wiser, and I think that will change things over time.
And I think there's also a trade-off between risk-reward,
Yep.
the OpEx and the CapEx that you need to put in place, right? If companies can get away with not making the investments, then the reliability probably goes down. But they're only going to feel it the moment something breaks.
Exactly.
And I think that's sometimes when regulation is not a bad thing. When they say, look, you want to play in this space, you may have to have routes, 2 routes or 3 or 4, or you may have to move your data centers, or you need to have backup sites. I mean, we didn't have Sarbanes-Oxley before. We didn't have some of these things. And I think September 11 was a wake-up call to say, guys, look, I mean, if something like this should happen again, I mean, we wipe out the U.S. economy, right?
Yeah.
So what is it that we're going to do? And I think as applications move into the cloud, and I tend to say that technology is very cyclical, right? Every so many years, sometimes it's 10 years, sometimes it's 30 years, you're reinventing yourself again, right? We used to call it grid computing first, now we call it cloud, then we're going to have something else. But the reality is that if you implement cloud well, and you implement fiber networks well, and you're going to have your data stored in different locations. You don't even have to look at Wall Street. I mean, look at what happened with Amazon. Amazon was selling their services. You pay little money, you're in one of their data centers. You pay a little bit more money, you're replicated, because they realize that there's a value, right? But they didn't have that as a product. They only had that as a product the moment one of their big data centers, I think in Culpeper, went down. And then people are saying, well, wait a minute, my marketplace is gone. Brick and mortar doesn't exist. It's all right there, in software.
I think that's right. Real
Right.
quick.
Well, yeah, this whole thing about diversity reminds me of a smart engineer I had who, when we would try to design things redundantly and spend money, he'd look at me and say, Raul, the world's a single point of failure. So the reality is that no matter what you do, something's going to happen
Right.
to create, a disruption, and that's just part of life.
Isn't
I
there a
think
bumper
that sums
sticker
it
about
up
that?
really well.
Yeah, that's right.
So there are
Technology's built to break. Yeah.
fragility and anti-fragility.